corrected on that, but it's certainly been a long time. So it's not a common occurrence. And this particular visit with King Charles was extraordinary. All kinds of messaging, signals, anomalies. I'd like you to share with us what you saw and what is the true significance from SG's lens with regards to the King's visit.
Well, it's fascinating that you should start the conversation off with that particular topic because it tees up, I think, a lot of what we're going to get into for this short broadcast today. Fundamentally, John Michael, when we look at what happened with the King and the English monarchy, the English crown coming over and paying homage to the American president, being hosted by the American president inside the vassal territory of Washington, D.C., on the grounds of the White House. Now, this is after we've laid claim to the White House under the laws of war, right? And we saw that happen between January of 2021 and January of 2025. There's different punctuation marks along the way, the planting of dual 88-foot flagpoles, various construction projects that were done during the Biden era, certain military decorum and tapestry that was sort of woven out there for people in the very early days. All of this signaling to us that jurisdiction with Washington, D.C. changed fundamentally during the first Trump presidency and then during the interim period where we saw this Manchurian Biden operation from ostensibly what was supposed to be the Oval Office. And so now here we are, early 2026, and we have the English crown coming to visit. This is after the Queen's death, right, which was on 9/8 of 2022. So 9 plus 8 is 17 of the year 2022. Interesting to note for your audience as sort of a sidebar, unrelated to the Charles issue, but the day after the English Queen Elizabeth II, passed away publicly, 9/8/2022, on 9/9, Nintendo, the largest gaming company in the world, released one of their highly sought impending game releases that was going to happen. It was going to happen all across the Western world, and the title of the game was The Legend of Zelda: Tears of the Kingdom. So as we look at what's happening right now with King Charles, it's all symbolic. It all pays homage to what's going on in the broader landscape of this irregular conflict that you and I talk about frequently on air. But when we look at the visit itself, what were the marks that show clearly what happened? Well, we have an obvious changing of authority because we saw beehives involved. When we look at the traditions and the internal culture of the British royal family and a European aristocratic high society over the last 1,000 years, those that kept the beehives were regarded as the wealthy landowners. They were the barons, the earls, the kings, the queens, the royals, the governors, things of that nature. Honey has always been a delicacy in the food world. When we look back over the last couple of 1,000 years, 3,000 years, really all of the way back to ancient Egypt, is sort of this, it's like having the fat sheep, right, to keep with the comparison there. And so when we look at those traditions over the last 1,000 years or so, when there was an aristocratic changing of the guard, when there was a monarch that had passed or someone that had moved into a position of authority or a pulpit of power, one of the things ritualistically that was done was the old guard would walk with the new guard. In other words, the outgoing would walk with the incoming, and they would go visit the beehives of the local estate or of the local manor, or whatever it happened to be. Either in the British Isles or in Central Europe. I don't want to get too bogged down in the details, but fundamentally what would occur is they would inform the bees that there had been a change of power. And so that's exactly what we saw happening here in the United States of America with the English king and with the English queen both. So in other words, we have dual sides, the masculine and the feminine of the monarchical line represented here during this gestural process. And something that I thought was absolutely incredible, John Michael, is as this entire process goes on, we have these, public statements that are made, these very sort of pomp and nostalgic and throwback to yesteryear type of statements coming from King Charles. We have President Trump talking a little bit about that, also talking about his own royal lineage through the Scottish MacLeod line, which I submit to you, that's probably why we didn't hear much from the No Kings protesters, because they were all having heart attacks when they realized what was actually happening with respect to who President Trump and his family line really truly is. But when we look at that entire situation and we appreciate it holistically for what it conveys to us here as Americans, we saw the President Trump saluting during the English national anthem. We saw Melania with hand over her heart during both national anthems. President Trump, I think, also did salute during the Star Spangled Banner, but I found it interesting that we were seeing these gestures of claimsmanship, essentially, right? Gestures of allegiance. When one is paying homage to, an anthem that's being played in a military fashion. It wasn't that President Trump put his hand over his heart. It was a military salute. That in and of itself implies that has been a jurisdictional shifting of the guard somewhere along the way. And all of the behavior from the royal couple really seems to confirm that over time. And I'll end this opening segment with this point, John Michael. When we look at the movement of that day, the clothing, the environment that was created, the various news shots that were created, the state dinner and how that was presented, and the angles that were chosen, why they were chosen, the colors, the tablecloths, things like that. You had a lot of Tiffany blues, spread throughout all of these things. You had a lot of gold and gold accent, a lot of black and white, which tends to tie into that sort of symbolic power balance shifting. Black and white is a very common thematic contraction, I think is what I'm trying to say, in those areas of the world. Excuse me. And so in those elitist families, it means a great deal to them. And so to see all of this on display while King Charles is simultaneously telling the American people and the world that he draws a great deal of inspiration from Christianity. This is the guy who comes from a satanic British royal line, and he's now being forced to stand in front of the world and essentially sing the praises of Christ and the example that Christ gave everyone. And on top of that, we're seeing these silent passage of authority ceremonies that are happening, and then to sort of ice that entire cake, Melania Trump, for the entire day's festivities, at least for the first half of the day prior to the state dinner later that evening, she was dressed in what was clearly a callback, what was clearly an outfit purposefully chosen to be extremely closely representative of several of Princess Diana's favorite outfits.
Yes, interesting, huh? Let me ask you this, SG. Would you agree that this may be sort of the lid on the jar? It began perhaps many years back when President Trump visited the Queen before she passed, and those protocols that were bypassed. Would it be a fair summary to state that began the trajectory of things that have followed right up till today with the King, that pretty much ends their rule and our freedom? Would that be a fair statement?
Well, I do think symbolically what you've seen is a passing of the torch now and a true conclusion. And I don't mean to sound hyperbolic with it, but I think that when we look at the symbolism, when we look at the speeches that were made, the callback to the revolution, the discussion of the Civil War, the discussion of the extremely close relationship that President Trump stressed a number of different times, amongst the backdrop of things having to also change. And then the symbols and the rituals that we talked about a moment ago, which, to your average onlooker who's not looking for something like that and attempting to find the meaning in these meetings and in these gestures and things, they're not going to mean anything to them. But these are dramatically important when looked at through the lens of an elitist. That's all these people work with is symbolism. They believe the esotericism rules the day. They put it in their labels. They put it in their signage, their marketing, their advertising. It's on their money. It's on every single thing that they have access, power, and control over. And so to see those rituals played out in a fashion that is basically bequeathing power to we the people of the United States of America by the English monarch on U.S. military soil, and that's the key here. These actions were not done amongst the several states of the Union. They were done in the territory of what was formerly the national government and what is currently under the military domain of the United States Armed Forces. So looking at that, John Michael, I think that we have a conclusion to the American Revolution. I think that we finally have freedom in the sense that there is self-determination, which can be representative in the areas that count. It's not just at the ballot box, it's at the banking establishment. It's not just at the ballot box or the voting booth or the county courthouse. It's in the law enforcement precinct. It's in the judiciary. It's in the oaths that people collect amongst the several states of the union and who they're actually pledging their allegiance to and how these oaths are structured. All of this will be a downhill trickle effect, I think, from what we saw take place. I really don't think that it can be overstated. And when you pass that against the backdrop of the petrodollar basically being gutted, it's clear that this is a transfer not only of political autonomy and political freedom and monetary self-determination to we the people of the United States from the English monarch and both sides again of that monarchy, the king and the queen. But it is also fundamentally a transferring of the financial power in the world from a highly concentrated sort of concentric group spanning North America and Europe out into a much more decentralized landscape where everyone needs to be responsible for bringing valuations to the table. And you asked me about whether this is the end of the English line or not. I think that that process was indeed set up when President Trump and Queen Elizabeth II had their first round of meetings in 2018. So with respect to where the line actually ends and if it comes to sort of an abrupt ending, which I think some people are expecting it to do, I think that may be more reliant on what Prince William and Prince Harry do after this particular period of time when Charles exits stage left.
Great analysis. Thank you. It's an extraordinary series of events are unfolding, and I wouldn't say a full-blown fire hose, but they come. The White Hats, Trump, the military, the plan, the team, they're coming at us with a pretty forceful hose right now on multiple fronts, that being one of them. And this dovetails perfectly into the monetary aspect of what I'd like you to weigh in on. We know, of course, we've discussed it, those that follow broadcasts like mine and yours and so forth, they understand that the Federal Reserve and the IRS are illegal, unconstitutional, and are being dismantled. But I want to get into a bit of the micro of the how this continues to play out as we fast forward a bit. We still use Federal Reserve notes, you and I, the ladies in their pocketbooks, you and I in our wallets. We still have those little green pieces of paper, whether it's through credit, but that's the system we're using. We're using those Fed notes still. So to say that the Federal Reserve is gone completely wouldn't really be a full and true statement because we're using their money as debt. So but we also know the dismantling that began, I think as far back as 2020, the first move the president made, taking some powers away from the Fed into the Treasury. We know all that has transpired since and ongoing now with the comms we get directly and indirectly, and mostly directly, from Dan Scavino, from the president himself, from Scott Bessent, most notably March 26th, the release, a press release I'll call it, from the Treasury Department itself, where not one time was the word Federal Reserve in there. And yet they were talking about the issuance of a new currency with the president's signature on it. So having laid that down as a groundwork, I now get into my question. And it speaks to the future, but I think the future is coming pretty soon. So I'd like you to weigh in on this. Now, we know the Federal Reserve, as we know it, is not going to be part of the future. And thank goodness for that. Illegal, unconstitutional, so forth. Okay, but how? That's the key word. How do we make, and one last thing, we know clearly, you know better than most, how that there is a new system set up to replace SWIFT, QFS, crypto, so forth, stable coins, restoring the currency, first our dollar, backed by gold and silver and sovereign wealth funds and so forth and so on. There's the big picture. But again, we still have Federal Reserve notes in our pocket. There'll come a point when we will have an option. And I think in there lies my question, and is how is that transition done? Will there still be Federal Reserve? And this, I know you didn't get the memo from President Trump last night, so this is your analysis and opinion, but will there be a transitionary period where, okay, we have the new that we can work in, a new greenback, we'll call it, with Trump's signature on it, that is backed by gold, other commodities, en route to digital down the line. We'll come there in a moment. So my question is this. I know it's been a long-winded setup because it's an interesting, real question. The layman will be wondering how. And so when do we stop using the Federal Reserve note? Did the Federal Reserve close their corporation and just fold up shop and do something else? Or are they still in existence for those in the world and us here at home that are still using their paper? What happens in that interim period where we exchange over into the new paper dollar and eventually digital? Hopefully with that long-winded setup, my question was understood. Take it away, SJ.
Well, I appreciate the thoroughness of it, actually, because it is a very baseline elemental question, but it's fundamental, I think, to everybody's concepts of what comes next with all of this. You know, the monetary aspect is relatable essentially to every human being on the planet, even those in many regards that, you know, in nowadays times, even those that are deep in tribal areas in, you know, fairly remote regions, they're still familiar with the concept of value exchange and what the prevailing currency of those areas is. And so all currencies come downhill of this central banking system, essentially. There's a couple of very small infinitesimal outsiders to that, having no serious power. I think there was a kingdom in Africa that was just but a few square miles at one point in time. And so there, you know, those types of areas, not a whole lot of you know, currency effect, but most major currencies, essentially all major currencies, have been downstream of this system that's been set up over the last couple of thousand years and reinvented several times along in that process. We've seen refinement, really, of the debt slave system taken from the days of old on through the last couple thousand years, and then especially through the period of the Vatican, and when the Vatican became very militarized, and casting forward to the present day. And I'm giving you a little bit of a thorough setup here for the answer, because it's sort of necessary to understand, I think, where the monetary aspect goes, because the question itself on the surface is, how does the Fed and the Treasury, what happens with that, and how do we look at money issuance going forward? But the essence, I think, of the question is, what does this decentralized landscape look like? How do we get these third-party institutions, these middlemen essentially, out of the way so that we, the people, are able to transact P2P in a secure fashion that does not have us at risk, 24 hours a day from some, unwell-to-do actor out there, or someone with a pinch on their shoulder who's going to try and buck the system and be that example because they have a little bit of a rebel streak in them. And I think might be the most difficult question of our time, because honestly, it depends on how these geopolitical processes that are currently in play, fix themselves out and move forward to bring that mass public consciousness along. We're talking about, topics on this particular broadcast that I would estimate, based on the awakening gradient that we see across the West, would probably appeal to a solid 50% of the population, maybe as high as 65%, maybe 70% in certain key areas for certain topics. But you still have a good block out there that doesn't have a grasp on some of the nuance of these geopolitical events in these times that we're living. They don't understand the war against the Rothschild Bank of International Settlements. They don't understand that there is a concentrated insular power structure inside their national finance system that is not under their control. It's not constitutional. It's not. It doesn't have any domestic effect to it. It's in other words, it's all a foreign lobby. It's a foreign agent that's been placed inside everyone's nations in this financial aspect, and a lot of people are still just working up to that point. That's where they're at on the bell curve, if we can say that. Yeah. So, if I were to try and place myself at the highest levels of planetary strategy for a moment, and try to appreciate how can we move from one exchange system to another exchange system while simultaneously accomplishing all of these other awakening events that have to happen. And when we talk about those, let's give a couple of brief examples. The extraterrestrial discussion has to be had. We have to have clarity on that. We have to have transparency on that. Regardless of whatever camp you sit in the present day, here and now, with respect to that issue, the public discourse has not occurred. We've not settled the matter on what the heck is going on with that. Black sites, black budget operations, the immense amount of siphoning. that has gone on across the entirety of the West, and where those funnels and channels and avenues actually go to and lead. We have a lot of discourse about these, but we've not settled the issue, I think, nationally or even culturally across the Western world and the post-Commonwealth realms on which one of those areas were the most problematic and were beyond saving versus the ones that can still be used. And I think that's, we might be even premature on that discussion anyway, because we're using some of those institutions in the here and now for good causes. So these are just a couple of examples of things that have to be hashed out alongside the change in monetary behavior and management, alongside where money originates from and where it returns to. And so with the Federal Reserve and the Treasury, I'm going to speak just from the United States lens here because I'm not versed in any other nation state infrastructure with this. But with the Federal Reserve and the Treasury, I think that we have to have the Federal Reserve held accountable at minimum in a U.S. court of law for the greatest counterfeiting and usury operation ever contrived in all of the history of man. And I think that has to be adjudicated in the public record. Perhaps it's even adjudicated by the Supreme Court, which would be very, I think, apropos and poetic. And at the same time, I do think that we need a concurrent situation where a vacuum with a need to be filled is created in the financial economic ecosystem that we use inside the United States of America. And there's a lot of different ways that you could produce such a vacuum situation. You could certainly have a 2008 style event that would produce a situation of pretty immediate gravitas and need. You could have a national emergency or a nationwide terrorism style event, which affects perhaps electronic infrastructure or resource-based infrastructure, which then affects downstream power and the ability for things to, keep the lights on, if you will. You could have a cyber event of some kind. You could blame it on an astronomical event like a solar flare, behavior going on with the sun. You could even actually tie in the UFO component and blame such a situation on the realization that there are actually other sentient beings out there. And I could very much see some of our Luciferian opponents who remain on the battlefield trying to shift blame in that direction to buy that time to get away. So any of those situations, I think, would provide the catalyst for Treasury and the President and Congress to all work together very publicly and very rapidly to basically reverse what was done under the Franklin Delano Roosevelt administration in the early 1930s when they rolled out the banking reforms. They were slamming legislation through the Congress in days, and we saw President Roosevelt issuing executive orders that were being codified by the Congress within weeks. I think that we would see a similar situation in the other direction were we to see one of those instigating events. And I want to drill down on the instigating event component because that becomes everybody's next question. Well, if that's what it's going to take to move us there, what are these events going to look like? How are they going to be? What's going on here? I don't think that is something we can really do much speculation on with any amount of accuracy at this point, because you're talking about picking from a haystack of literally 100,000 different options that would meet the flow of whatever the objective here, the ultimate aim is. But I think what is certain is that whatever occurs will be at a national scale, at least here in the United States of America. It's likely to involve standoff-style behavior between the major superpowers around the world, because those are the precipitative moments that we've seen over the last couple of hundred years. It's very relatable in the pattern of our consciousness as a collective civilization, both here in the West and around the world. It's understood how these dynamics then produce immediate geopolitical change afterward. And it's likely to also affect our day-to-day experience for a brief period of time. We've been told phrases like 10 days of darkness, 7 days of darkness, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. I think timeframes are unimportant, but what is important to know is that from 2018 even to last week, we are getting consistent and unusual in their frequency emergency alert and emergency broadcast system tests across all manner of devices here in the United States of America. And in 2018, in October of 2018, a completely new category was added to that emergency broadcast repertoire called presidential memorandums and emergencies. So when we look at what's coming here, there's clearly been preparation made to have direct communication with the public through these devices that we run around with in our pockets all the time, or the ones that are hanging on our screens in the kitchen. And I think those events lead us into the conditions you described, which is, why do we even have a Federal Reserve?
Well said. Thank you. I pulled something up I'm going to have you comment on in a moment, but let me follow up a bit. Keep it simple, Sam. Bottom line to me, I believe that it's one of two things. As you've somewhat indicated, this could be through these various different trigger point events, there could be an abrupt change, and that's gone, and this is here, and that's that. That's one way this could play out, where we no longer are using Federal Reserve notes in our pocketbooks. Instead, we have the new Trump money, we'll call it, which is, I shouldn't call it Trump money, but you understand what I'm saying, constitutionally sound money, and the Fed is done. That's a possibility. The other possibility is, after some pain and some more things we're going to go through, we don't have time, you and I, to get into the bond collapse and all the other things that we're talking about. But as far as the currency goes, let's assume it gets driven down further, and at some point it gets rescued with a new currency. Some people say that's happening in July. I'm not quite sure of that, but it's going to happen. But the other way, there's the one scenario of dead, done, finished, goodbye, here's the new currency. Or, hey, here's an alternative. You've got a period of time to convert your Federal Reserve notes into the new dollar, and hopefully it's fair exchange. Could there be an aspect of that takes place? In other words, not the sudden death, but a buffer transfer period of time. If you think about it, then we're talking about just us, we the American people, 350 million of us, whatever it is, with US dollars in our pockets. Now, there's, of course, the rest of the world that's dealing with central banks, dealing with dollars that they may have. That's a whole different conversation, and it's probably one and the same. But as far as we here at home, just a brief comment on, could it also play out the way I said? Well, we don't want anything to do with it anymore, this Federal Reserve note, so do what you want, Fed, and those that want that money. We have this new money, and there'll be an exchange center or a bank where you swap it out. Is this oversimplified? Am I crazy? Is that a possibility?
Well, I think it is a possibility, because when you look at phasing this type of landscape into another type of landscape, basically bringing a square peg and actually managing to fit it inside of a round hole, I think what you have there is intrinsically some overlap that just has to occur. Mm-hmm. And so as people learn more about the monetary situation, as they learn more about the dynamics of the debt landscape with the United States, and probably concurrent with some of these escalating geopolitical events, we would still see some of that escalation. You'll have to pardon me, John Michael, I apologize. We would still see some of that escalation, I think, even alongside sort of a slower, softer, gentler process. But I think that's very plausible as we look at what's happening here. And really, I think both scenarios are plausible, because we have precedents in the last 50 years of history to see both of those scenarios as having actively taken place. When we were taken off of the gold standard by Nixon for nation-state transactions at the same time, or right around the same time that we saw the petrodollar arrangement put out, that was a very slow burn, but it caused a dramatic and world-altering change in just a matter of a couple of decades, really a little bit less than that. But by the time we were in the mid-1990s, it had clearly solidified a completely new world archetype. We were, of course, that was beyond the collapse of the Russian economy, the Soviet Union economy. Mm-hmm. We've also seen dramatic events like the 2008 event, 9/11, and the economic reverberations that occurred after that, and the measures that were taken at the nation-state level to secure not only things militarily, but also transactions and the emerging digital landscape and space. A lot of people talk about the Patriot Act and that, and I'm certainly no fan of the Patriot Act. It's the most unpatriotic act, I think, that's been passed in the last half century here in the United States, for sure. But it did have some interesting arguments that I think deserve merit on their own with respect to how do we intercept, ne'er-do-wells that are moving large sums of money through private arrangements to actually do harm. In other words, when there are those scenarios where harm is truly intended, and there's evidence to show that, and there would be a lawful basis then to intervene with that, how do we accomplish that? I think some of that has to come out in this process as well. So I think it is. I think both scenarios have equal weight of possibility. As a matter of fact, I think that you're going to have some financial exchange and some hand holding, if you will, even if things move fairly rapidly. Right? You could transfer the economic core, the foundation itself, back at the heart of Treasury, at the heart of the government, or whatever, in a relatively short amount of time. But you're still going to have this sort of all hands on deck ecosystemic approach to bringing everyone into the fold. And that would have to happen at the point of sale. That would need to be in the community. That would need to be right up the road from them. Community banks comes to mind with ideas on that. And that's just, again, my own speculation. I don't have good insider knowledge. But when we look at reaching people rapidly with a common message, that's certainly one way to do it. And I find it very fascinating then when we look at utilizing their current infrastructure to do something like that. When you go back to 2020 and you look at some of President Trump's executive orders, specifically about bringing special purchase vehicles to Treasury vis-a-vis the Federal Reserve, what it basically did was it nationalized all of the operative mechanisms for providing liquidity for the Federal Reserve itself, and certifying that all of those liquidity needs were able to be met, and that assets were still able to be acquired by the institution itself. And so looking at that in the landscape that plays out after that, we've sort of already created the hardware, if you will, the wiring in the walls to bring the Fed inside of Treasury at some point in the future anyway. And it could be as seamless as an executive order publicly signed with Scott Bessent standing in the background.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what comes to my mind is this, as you just indicated, there'll be this period where decisions will be made in exchange and of the currency. I think once that's done, and whether it's abrupt or over a period of time, the next thing will happen, the same modus operandi mechanics that gravitated us away from the Fed note into the new U.S. dollar. I think then the next trajectory, the next step is getting us comfortable and giving us a period of time and educating us and weighing out the pros and cons of, hey, you don't need the piece of paper anymore. We have a stable coin that's going into a QFS and so forth and so on. I think that's what we're going to be experiencing in very oversimplistic terms, perhaps over the next couple of 3 years. I want to ask you one more question on the economic related area, and then I want to get into Kash Patel. You mentioned aliens. I'm going to go there in a moment, and I want to talk about the storm. I'm going to read a post in a second from the president. But before we wrap up with those issues, the last thing on the economic related area, the banks, central banks, the naked shorts, the game they've been playing. You got banks and countries now paying far more than the spot price for silver based on all the mechanics that we've talked about before. My question to you is, where is that at right now? In other words, how much more time is left in SG Anon's crystal ball that the banks can continue? Because right now, I mean, they haven't been able to pound silver down below 72. They haven't been able to pound gold down below 4,400. In the past, these growth spurts would have been hammered right back down. Silver would be at $40. Gold would be, back to 2,000. They can't do that anymore. They've gone as low as 72, we've seen, since that spike at 120 on silver. We've gone as low as, say, 4,400 on gold since its spike about 5,000. We're in that range. We're hovering in that range. A lot of the experts I interview on my Global Financial Reset show feel that that's going to be the lowest we'll be at right now. What's your take on the mechanics of the central bank losing control over the manipulation of the price points of gold and silver, or real money? When do you see the handcuffs completely off and gold and silver catapulting to the levels that you and many others have forecast of where these two shiny metals are heading? How much more, and again, crystal ball, how much more time before you see the chains off and silver going to 120 and 200 and 300 and gold going to 5, 6, and 7,000?
Well, it's funny, and without being a financial advisor, I think I have to look at President Trump's behavior and the rhetoric that he has put out, because we know that he's very closely connected to this currency financial transformative situation that's going on. He declared so publicly in September of 2018. Your audience can go back and double check that, his comments alongside Prime Minister Shinzo Abe of Japan, rest his soul. And so looking at what's happening right now in the world, everybody that has an issue with the warfare situation that's happening, or the large request for military budgets or things like that, or the people that are looking at these things, and of course, on their surface, the obvious reproach from them is, well, why are we investing so heavily in that? We should invest in these potholes or in these roads or in these power lines, and all of these things are, I think, justifiable points to have. But when we look at the financial landscape and what's going on right now worldwide with the petrodollar, what's going on with the Swiss banking mafia in particular, and I want to bring them up especially because when we look at the Swiss financial economic space and how that sort of sits alongside these central banks. The central banks are sort of private public institutions, but the Swiss private bankers are heavily involved and invested with the Rothschilds and with the WEF and the WHO and the UN and things of that nature, and they are players at the table as well. They're just not as big as some of these very large families that we hear the names of a lot. Hear the names of a lot is what I'm trying to say. And so, looking at what's going on in the aftermath of the situation with the Strait of Hormuz, in the aftermath of what's been happening inside global shipping, in the aftermath of what's been going on inside resource markets, especially fuel and oil and crude markets all around the planet, it is an absolute death spiral being created for the petrodollar, and it's also forcing U.S. Treasury debts to be offloaded by some of these Gulf member states that have been holding those debts for a very long time, and really some of them have been holding them at gunpoint from the Western world intelligentsia community that managed to get infiltration into that area of the world in the mid-20th century. And so that is producing conditions which are clearly going to remove the petrodollar at some point. The hegemony is going away. Everybody knows it. Everybody, perhaps outside of President Trump right now, is having a pretty public conversation about how even if you agree fundamentally with the president's reasoning for doing or not doing certain things, what is not out of confusion whatsoever is that it's harmful for the petrodollar ecosystem. But when we look at that ecosystem as being the lifeblood of this old school debt enslavement system, this Federal Reserve, post-Phoenician Canaanite debt system that exists where money is based on nothing, which is a complete inversion of the very concept of value itself, then the death of the petrodollar begins to make a lot of sense and actually begins to look like a really great thing. Now add into that the level of military spending recently requested by the Pentagon, the numbers that are coming from the administration with respect to procurement of armaments. President Trump meeting with defense contractors sometime over the last 2 to 4 months to speed up certain production of armaments, and the armaments that were requested weren't released to the public, but that was what we were told the meeting was about, was increasing the procurement and the ratio of actually doing this. When you look at what those types of deep and very large transnational corporate economic activities produce inside of the metal space, it becomes impossible for the other side of the seesaw to stay on the ground. What happens is you end up forcing the load bearing that has been placed downward on these metal markets, silver especially, by the billions of dollars, and in some cases tens of billions of dollars in derivative short bets and option bets against these commodity spaces and against these metal spaces by the big banking institutions, who themselves own a tremendous amount of the supply, which is why they're able to throw their weight around like that. When you remove the effectiveness of that suppressive activity, then the price begins to rise. And marry that, John Michael, with the fact that right now in the information age, it's not a few hedge funds or some financial gurus or some Wall Street junkies or some Reddit traders that are going to notice what's happening with these markets, which are pivotal and foundational to sustaining the debt enslavement system's longevity. It's the entirety of the retail marketing landscape. It's literally 3 billion potential buyers of these particular metals and of these particular spaces when you look at just the population of the English-speaking world and the Western realm itself. And that, understood in the broader context of transforming worldwide finance, we are literally watching a silent, irregular, sleight of hand warfare scenario playing out, where the moves that are occurring in the surface level space, the Iranian situation, the Ukrainian situation, soon to be the Taiwanese situation, all of the transformation across Africa with respect to resource valuations, the removal of Maduro and the opening up of the resources there in Venezuela to be valued by who? By U.S. corporations who are subject to U.S. jurisdiction. The increase of Russia's economic activity and the alignment that they've brought to not only the entirety of Eurasia, but they're even sort of balancing out Europe, sort of like how a parent, satiates a petulant teenager because they still understand what's best for the teenager anyway. All of this is showing us that a transformative situation is happening inside metals markets and really inside tangibles markets, just anything of true, tangible, and real value, which is going to incinerate all of the suppressive market activities that have been leveled against these market spaces for well over 100 years, just in their current form. You spoke at the very beginning of this question segment about what occurred in January when they had serious suppressive action applied to the market, major flooding the zones style buy-ins and sell-offs that were transacted at very, very high levels very quickly, and it sent the silver price just plummeting from like $118 or $117 an ounce down to the high 60s to low 70s. In that period that followed that, immediately after those events, Deutsche Bank, one of the largest banks in Europe and one of the major transnational institutions involved in not only currency and monetary manipulation, but the illicit funding of certain criminal and illegal activities around the planet, that institution offloaded every single option call that it had against silver on the entirety of its balance sheet. In other words, they took a hit on the balance sheet at a 100% level with respect to these option calls, because they knew that this process, what they had just been able to do by getting the price back down enough to offload like that, they knew that they were not likely to achieve that level again. And so they made the strategic call to offload the entirety of the bad debt. That tells me, and again, I'm not a financial advisor, but that implies to me, John Michael, that Deutsche Bank confirmed in February privately, sort of indirectly, that they don't think silver is ever going to go below $72, $73, $74 an ounce ever again. Bank of America, one of the largest institutions in the entirety of the Western world financially, and one of the major investors in a dramatic level of the commodities and infrastructural space in the United States through their controlling interest in a company called BlackRock, Bank of America put out a statement just earlier this year saying that they believed it could go as high as $300 an ounce just this year, talking about silver specifically. Yeah. That implies a dramatic change in supply and demand economics, and potentially even a valuation situation that comes from a governmental level, which adds a great deal of value on top of what the fair market value would already be. And if Bank of America thinks that it could go to $300 an ounce this year, how far could it go in one more year, John Michael? Because that's a rise of several 100% just in 1 year. So through exponential mathematics, by the time we get to the end of this decade, just a few short years from now, you could legitimately see silver somewhere between $800, $900, $1,000 an ounce, maybe even as high as $1,200 or $1,300 or $1,400 an ounce. And it would not surprise me at all if gold is $10,000 an ounce by 2030.
Wow, that was so well said. Thank you. And then there's, of course, talk about the president potentially setting floors to the metals, and also repricing gold's value from the Fed's books of $42 to $20,000. And there's also that potential move. But that aside, you just laid it down. So thank you very much. Just due to time constraints, I want to have you weigh in on some issues with Cash Patel. Cash Patel has stated in no unmistaken terms, I caught a segment of his interview with Maria Bartiromo a week or two ago. He stated in no unmistaken terms that arrests are coming, and he said very soon. He didn't say grand juries, indictments, a process, a delay, a challenge, let the story go away. He said in no unmistaken terms that arrests are coming, arrests very soon concerning the election theft and interference from 2016 forward. We hear names like Brennan, Clapper, Comey, Strzok, Page, and the rest of that clan during that period of time. I'll call them the low-lying fruit. We remember our president has stated, and in writing and publicly in pressers and meetings, all roads lead to Obama. This is the low-lying fruit, in my simple terms, that lead to Obama. And I take Kash Patel on his word, and I say Kash Patel will be slapping handcuffs on people fairly soon. Tell us how you see this proceeding, and what might we expect in terms of retaliation and any disruptions as we start to get closer and closer and closer to the jugular.
Well, I think as far as retaliation, disruption, obfuscation, you're going to see, again, an escalation from even the things that we've witnessed just over the last 6 to 12 months. Well, I guess it's now 14 months going back to the inauguration of January of 2025. And what those could be, I mean, again, that's a pretty large quiver. You could see things in the infrastructural space. You could see things in the transportation space, certainly more false flag style events with respect to aerospace, aviation, because that's something that gets people's attention, I think, in a sort of a special and a significant way here in the United States. But with respect to the arrests that are oncoming and how that process goes down, one of the things we have to remember, and it's easy to get buried in the tidal wave of information that's hitting us all of the time, right? Because you have individuals out there that follow only X, and that's essentially become, the global news wire. And you have individuals out there that follow the mainstream and X and other social media platforms like Blue Sky and Facebook. And you have others that get their news from a constellation of sources, both printed and digital. And so in an era where the information seems to multiply exponentially as it comes at us, it's really easy to get mired down in what occurred yesterday, what comes next, how is that going to affect things, where are we at, this and that and the other. But when we appreciate the basics, and we have to keep in mind the basics are given to us through trial and error, process of elimination, logical conclusion. There's an entity online that I take a lot of inspiration from. It's a faceless entity called Q. Told people all of the time, logical thinking rules the day. It's all about logical thinking. 2 + 2 = 4. And so looking at what's happening in the present day and time, what do we already know? What can we already say is true? Well, we know that President Trump has shared a number of times on Truth Social in the last 2.5 years this image of President Obama and Joe Biden sitting in the White House, or President Obama sitting in the White House with Trump himself post-election 2016. And the image is captioned, retruth if you want to see a televised military tribunals, Obama is guilty of treason, something along those lines.
That's right.
So for a current commander-in-chief to put something like that out, something that gravitational, that enormous in its breadth and in its weight and in what it actually means, I think that alone should be examined for what's happening here. This is not some low-life nut job who is mad at Obama and who wants to see some justice administered because he lost his house. This is the current commander-in-chief of the military saying that military justice will be rendered for a former commander-in-chief. That's a big deal.
It is.
Outside of that, we have DNI Gabbard just in the last 14 months seizing election equipment from 3 major areas and sending requests for information to DOJ about at least 2 other areas with respect to the 2020 election. And those areas that information was taken from was Maricopa County, Fulton County, and Puerto Rico. All of those areas are areas that were mentioned, again, by a lot of different reports early on with the fraud that came out of 2020. They were mentioned explicitly by name by that entity called Q that we referenced a moment ago. I don't think Fulton County was, but Georgia itself as a hotbed of fraud was referenced there. And so looking at all of that, again, the conspiracy to overthrow the government of the United States, which becomes the hindsight investigation that we're all sort of now having together. It begins with Obama, it begins with Russiagate, but it includes so many more actors, private and public, nonprofit and for-profit, domestic and foreign, individual and corporate. And so all of these institutions, actors, entities that are involved in this, they have to have the strings separated from the ball of yarn, if you will. You have to untangle the ball of yarn, keeping certain threads intact. And when you get to those major threads in the middle, the ones that hold the ball itself together, I think that's when you're likely to see serious pushback. And I think at this point, John Michael, we're probably not quite to those big middle threads yet, but we're well into the surface of the ball by now. We're going into sort of this area where the threads become interwoven much more tightly, and you're starting to notice a difference in bonding and how, pulling this ball apart is becoming a little bit more, it's having to be done a little bit more delicately and a little bit more quickly, because else you lose your momentum and you end up tangling yourself up all over again. And I think with Kash Patel's most recent comments to Maria Bartiromo, talking about arrests are coming, those things are coming. President Trump just put out an image 2 days ago or 3 days ago. Stop telling me what their crime was and start telling me when they're arrested for it. When you look at this, the information released again by DNI Gabbard over the last 14 months and how that ties into this grand conspiracy investigation that we know is happening in at least 3 separate jurisdictions amongst the several states of the union and being handled by grand juries, because that's now been confirmed out to us through several mainstream media reporters with long-term reliable sources for these types of things. Mm-hmm. All of it, I think, blends together to bake this really incredible umbrella-style pie that captures everybody, that ensnares everyone that was involved in the manufacturing of intelligence, the movement of the dossier through the former administration out into the public domain, the leaking of information from inside the first Trump administration after Trump finally came to power, the shadow presidency that ran alongside that, and then the successful overthrow publicly of the government of the United States in 2020, which Anons would then pipe in at that point of the conversation and say, which is why President Trump constantly points to his favorite chart, which shows him leaving office in April of 2020 under continuity of government purposes.
Wow, extraordinary. I mean, if you folks go back and listen to this, extraordinary times we're in. I'm looking at an image right now, SG. If I had my producer and we were doing a full-scale production versus a special broadcast, I'd display it. But it's easy to describe. The president just published this, I don't know, within 48 hours. And I'm looking at a picture of the president on Truth Social. The image is a background of the president, his eyes looking intently. And then the forefront is the president's torso profile, serious. And the headline is, "The storm is coming. Nothing can stop what is coming." By the way, there's a very nice letter Q standing right beside the president and right next to the background eye of the president. So there's your image. And the main message here is the storm is coming. Nothing can stop what's coming. Now, one quick comment, and then have you comment on this, is, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the Q board, if I'm quoting it accurately, stated, when we hear the president say, and this is my paraphrase, I guess, "My fellow Americans, the storm is upon us." Now, this doesn't say that. It says the storm is coming. This looks like a hat tip, and to let us know we're almost at that point where we'll get that notification. Am I reading this right? And by the way, the letter Q is in this. I find that extraordinary. What's your comments about this post?
It honestly, as I listened to you set this particular question up and describe the image shared to the president's Truth Social profile, it sounds like a really great sci-fi movie. It really sounds like a Clint Eastwood, Harrison Ford style thriller where coded symbolism and messaging is being used to convey, sensitive information about clear and present dangers to society and how we're going to get the public alongside with all of that. In other words, for the American population out there, especially anyone, probably mostly males above the age of 35 to 40 years old, you're going to be familiar with this constellation of media that seems to have pretty deep essences for the times that we're living right now. And that's exactly what you just described a moment ago to me. That's what it recalls for me. Excuse me, and takes me back to. When we look at how many times just in the last 36 months, President Trump has shared imagery to his Truth Social profile, both as a private citizen, as a presidential candidate, and then as the sitting president himself, which depicts the letter Q either in the image or on him, on his person, in the form of Q+.
Yes.
John Michael, I'm over 10 or 11 times just in the counting that I've done over the last couple of weeks, because I've been watching these types of activities coming, and it does not surprise me that President Trump has again shared this. And I think the post you referenced was just a few days ago.
Yes.
Just a couple of days ago. And so, when I think back to the post that he shared, I think it was late summer of last year, which showed him in sort of an AI rendering with a very confident, almost like, warrior president style pose, but very classy and Clark Kent-like in some ways. And it showed him slamming the beast or the snake or something like that on the ground. And he had a big Q+ on his lapel. One of the presidential envoys for the Russian president, President Putin, and I believe his name is Kirill Dmitriev. This is someone who has been to Mar-a-Lago several times, who negotiates strategic partnerships on behalf of the Russian government for other nations around the world, to include the West, to include the United States, of course. And this individual publicly shared the imagery that President Trump had placed on Truth Social and captioned it on his own X profile with the hashtag WWG1WGA. So it doesn't get higher level than the envoys of sitting presidents and sitting presidents themselves telling you that there is a reason to remain hopeful, that there is a reason to, that there is a confirmation happening in real time that control lies with those parties who are interested in humanity's best and highest and longest future, and who want a positive end to this entire process. And I think just by virtue of time passage, as we examine the last 10 years, if patriots were not in control, in other words, if there was some sort of co-opting, if we had fallen off of the train, if at some point along the way good guys had lost their influence or their edge or something along those lines, we never would have made it to the point that we are at now without some dramatic mass casualty or pre-extinction level style event happening. Because the game of risk that is being played and that has been played since the very first Trump administration, it's not for marbles and chump change at the end of the match. It's for all of the weaponry that's ever been accounted for here in this planetary domain. It's for sovereignty over this domain itself. It's for awakening to the reality of our place in the universe and where we fall within that constellation out there, amongst this idea that there's a grand chorus, and maybe it's not just us and us alone, which seems very vain sometimes when we look at it in that way. It's about all of these things: finance, economy, military, security, politics, decentralization, freedom, liberty. It's about all of it. And President Trump coming right out and confirming to us yet again that structural integrity is being maintained, that patriots have the wheel, that there's a method to the madness, if you will, with what's going on. It doesn't seem to get much more obvious than that.
Well said. Let's wrap this special broadcast up. It's sort of a nice dovetail coming off the heels of what we recently just spoke about with the low-lying fruit, roads leading to Obama, and you citing various different things the president has stated along those lines. The midterms, let's touch on that and wind this down. The midterms, the SAVE Act, we're waiting for it to pass. What is it, in the Senate now? These are the narratives I've caught on to. SAVE Act would get the job done. Will it pass? Highly unlikely. Okay, so then we hear a national state of declaration of emergency pertaining specifically to election protocols, where the president has published on the platforms numerous times stating we don't have a country unless we get free and fair elections. We need voter ID. You have to be a citizen. You have to have this, that, the other thing. And we're going to get it done with or without the SAVE Act. So these are the narratives that we see that are floating out there. Then there's another narrative that says there isn't going to be any voting. And there's a whole trajectory that discussion goes down. That's my setup. What's your views? Again, I know you didn't get the memo from the recent cabinet meeting or deep government think tanks, but what's your view? Because those are the three possibilities, really. We're either going to, one that's not a possibility, in my opinion. We're not going to have another election stolen. I believe that. But the chances of SAVE Act passing, I don't know, not so good. If that doesn't happen, you got the declaration of emergency where the president will make damn sure we have free and fair elections, and he's laid that out. And then there's a narrative that we might not be having that. Now I'm going to close out with the two-party system in a minute, but let me stop there, get your views on the midterms. What do you think might happen?
Well, I think it's really fascinating. The midterm situation, I think, becomes the broader discussion here as we look towards this potential 250th birthday that's coming up this summer, because it's sort of like the next major milestone after that birthday event. And all eyes are on July, but after that, it really will be all hands on deck for the election. Mm-hmm. I would tend to agree with you in the sense that I don't think whatsoever we're going to have anything stolen from us. I think that problem is, those bugs are being worked out of and worked through the system. It's almost every other week now that you can get on various search engines, and sometimes Google will pull them, but a lot of times Google won't. You'll have to use 2 or 3 search engines if you're really going to be dogged about your search. And you can look up election crime cases and election fraud cases and local officials and local people that have been charged with ballot engineering and ballot harvesting and ballot stuffing of boxes and things like that, or manipulating envelopes in their official capacity with like postal workers and stuff of that nature. And I say every other week. It's realistically probably about every other month at this point. At one point in time, it was every other week. But these cases continue to build up the legal precedent, the legal framework for the written record, which we know is so important to have. I don't think that the Save America Act is going to pass the Congress. I think it's actually being used as a very pronounced and very publicly obvious red pill, for lack of a better expression of it. I think it's to demonstrate to the American people that the Congress is captured in some way. The Congress has failed in its duty. It's not doing what it has to do to protect the very basis, the fabric. The people will say the quote unquote fabric of our democracy out there. They're not even doing the bare minimum to protect that. And we know that this is an 85 to 90% bipartisan issue, depending on which leftist poll you want to look at. It's probably in the 90s when people are properly understanding that what's in the Save America Act is, are you an American citizen? Are you going to be allowed to vote in a U.S. election or not? If you're not an American citizen, then you're not allowed to vote. And that's pretty much, I just summed up the entire proposed act right there.
Yes.
So looking at that being used as a giant red pill, it then provides us the premise to double down on securing these elections. And President Trump has told us that he will do that. He did sign recently an election security and integrity order. I forget the exact title of the order, but it's been within the last several weeks, maybe a couple of months now at this point, the last 6 to 8 weeks. And from what I understand in the initial reporting about what that was and how that order came out, it essentially secured the election landscape and forced the citizenship issue itself to at least be acknowledged. And it's currently being challenged on some grounds in different places, and we knew that those things were going to come. But seeing a congressional ineptitude on this particular issue very publicly primes the soil for what could then be a judiciary-style coup of the president's executive order, which is to say that you might see a court, perhaps it's the Supreme Court, perhaps it's a federal appeals court or a federal circuit court, attempt to strike down portions of or the entirety of that order on this particular basis or that particular ground. And if we see both the Congress and the judiciary simultaneously attack the election landscape, I think that provides us and remember, this is all happening on full public display because you now have the public plugged in through things like smartphones, tablets, their laptops at work, screens, TVs that are hanging on the wall in the break room or at their schoolhouse or whatnot. And so it's all happening on, pretty much in live time. We would be witnessing a failure to start on the legislative branch and an active antagonism, an active attack coming from the judicial branch. I think that provides us a great basis for the president to flex national emergency authority, which he's clearly demonstrated that he's willing to do. The place where this gets even more interesting, in my opinion, John Michael, is when we talk about the election landscape itself. We're also talking about the prospect of what comes from DNI Gabbard over the next, say, 8 to 16 weeks as we look at her investigation and her analysis, which is clearly coordinating with DOJ at some internal level, because there's been subpoenas and information requests and things like that that have been transitioned back and forth and fulfilled in that interagency partnership, that cooperative. What comes from some of those investigations could very well be evidence to show that 2020 was set up by the committers of the Russiagate coup, the Russiagate treason event. 2020 was purposefully oriented in the lead up to the election, and that could be even preceding COVID-19, to be an election that was an overthrow event, that was a national theft, essentially, a heist of the presidency, if you will, done by actors both domestic and foreign. If that type of revelation, which I don't believe seems extremely dramatic to prognosticate at this stage in the game, when we've seen Director Gabbard's rhetoric and the records that she's released about some of these other things, if that type of information came to light in the lead up to this midterm season, I think that would provide the president all of the basis of authority he would need to kick in certain components of EO 13848 and issue a new order dedicating some sort of secure election, designating some sort of secure election landscape in the absence of the Congress's intent and determination to do so. In other words, the elected body under the Constitution that was supposed to do this job did not do this job. And and again, I'm sort of speculating here. I want people to know I'm not proclaiming that this is by any means absolutely how things are going to happen. But what I'm saying is, from where I sit, with the types of problems that we have to reconcile at a systemic level, I think we have to have the election. I think the election itself is a birthright of the American heritage, and I think that maintaining the continuity of that process is paramount. I think the election probably does have to happen, but I think it has to happen under auspices that are very clearly secured and that demonstrate to the American people the failure of the other branches of government to do their job. And that happening on the heels of the 250th birthday of this country, I would find that extremely poetic, because that would then lead us directly into a period of a representative government having the reins of power, having the wheel, if you will, to take things where they need to go. And how rapidly would arrests and prosecutions and the civil levers of power and law and accountability and justice turn on the other side of something like that?
I think you're absolutely right about the activity that's going to transpire, that is transpiring right now with the Kash Patel narrative we just discussed, with the work the DNI is doing, as you stated. And it's only what month are we? I don't even know what time of the year it is. What is it? April? May 1st today here in Thailand. It's a long ways till November. And I believe the stage will be set. I believe the SAVE Act will not pass. And I believe, as you've just stated, it's highly probable that the president will use the power of these emergency acts and so forth to secure free and fair elections. Let's see how it plays out, but it's certainly going to be on the minds of everyone once we get through May 17th to July 4th, and from July 4th vote. And that leaves me with some couple of quick drive-by, quick statements to get quick answers from you on, and we'll conclude this special broadcast with SG Anon. Julian Assange is on the record. I don't have the quote in front of me, but I paraphrase it. On the record of stating many times, many years ago, that when all is said and done, in this disclosure game, this war we're engaged in, that 95% of Congress, of course, both sides of the aisle, will in fact be gone. And what we see here right now, I don't have any data in front of me, but it's been published. People have seen it. There's a long list of folks that are duly elected, serving themselves, but serving this country, that aren't going to run for office. Some are retiring. And then I would assert, to speak to Assange's point, that the rest of them, they'll be dealt with more than likely in the court system or in tribunals for their acts against the nation, violating the oath that they took. So if Assange is right, and 95% or so will be gone when all is said and done, to me, all is said and done in this context means the end of this present term. What are your comments about that? And then part B, and then it'll be the last thing I ask, is this statement playing out as stated, which I believe will, to some greater or lesser extent, probably within the time frame that I've just stated. If that happens, then the next question is, do we have a two-party system going into the next general election or the one after that?
Well, on the last aspect of that question, I think the political evolution of things may be outside of my philosophical pay grade, but I will say that I think the serious discourse about the efficacy of having a system that's bipolar in such a fashion and literally set up to be bipolar in that way, maybe that efficacy is not pragmatic for this information age that we're all moving into, and how can we secure the balance of power for the individual liberty, the protection of the right, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, the self-determinative ethos, but also provide for the collective good in a decentralized way that doesn't involve the middleman in a lot of ways. I think that discussion not only does it apply to finance, but I think it applies to the political landscape as well. With respect to, the current governmental landscape and how that plays itself out and sort of sees itself out the door, I think, which is what you were talking about a moment ago, 95% of things will be gone. I think a great deal of things will be handled and are being handled through the civilian justice levers. I think you've got a massive effort being undertaken by DOJ that's not being widely reported to investigate enormous amounts of fraud across all dimensions of society. You've got healthcare fraud, you've got crypto fraud, you've got finance fraud of both digital and physical kinds. You've got currency fraud, tech fraud, espionage, all of these types of things. Biological terrorism, trafficking of biological agents, obviously the human trafficking component. All of these are things that we've seen coming out over the last, couple of years at least, certainly, but definitely over the last, 6 to 12 months in a really, really heavy way. And so looking at what that does and the landscape that prepares itself for, and I guess the reason I'm going off on that tangent a little bit here is because when we look at the gravity of the problem, I think that we have to utilize as much of that 95%. We want to extract as much as we can with respect to benefit from that group,
right?
And let those civilian levers of justice turn, as long as they will, because you can get so much more intelligence in a way that is much more bulletproof and concrete for the annals of history and for telling the looking back on history and the story of how things happened. It's always the civilian levers of justice that really hold true and maintain ethos across great lengths of time, centuries, not decades. And when we finally arrive at the point where there is a military component, I think that is at the point where we will have to have we'll need to have already had an election, or we'll have to have an election, very proximally close to whatever those proceedings are, because they tend to progress very rapidly and they tend to reverberate through history with a much greater weight, a much higher gravitas. There's been a much more significant emergency that needed a harsher punishment and a message sent, as well as reconciliation and accountability to be had. And we know that those are coming as well. So it makes sense that we would either see them popping off this year, or we would see them beginning probably in 2027 at some point and moving towards 2028 and the general presidential election of that year. It's beyond my pay grade to say. I really couldn't tell you when, as far as the escalation all the way to the top of that particular pyramid. But the process itself, I think, leads us into this landscape where we get a representative government back, because when we remove, and if it has to be removed by force, then it has to be removed by force. But when we remove the thumb from the scale of the election process, when we take the manipulation out of the equation, it's only 1 or 2 cycles before we have a fully functional, we the people focused government that has the power of the purse, that has the power of oversight, that has the power of subpoena, reconciliation, that has the power of access, and can effectively administer what was always supposed to be our part of this trilateral constitutional system that we have in the United States.
Well said. These are extraordinary times, to say the least. And on that note, with the president informing us, and he used the word very soon, beginning to release what I think will be a drip. I don't think it'll be a fire hose. I could be wrong. But we're speaking about Area 51, UFOs, aliens, extraterrestrial, off-planet things that have been, to my understanding, on record since 1947, that every president has had access to. And President Donald Trump is going to start releasing this information. And in conjunction with that, I'm going to be launching a show, sort of an announcement here to everybody at JMC Broadcasting, probably in June. The latest will be July, to kind of cover what the president's releasing, and to, take it a few steps ahead with some experts and some people's opinions we may want to listen to, and people's experiences concerning the subject matter of these issues. And the show is going to be called Off Planet with JMC. So stay tuned, folks. It's time. It's time to go there. Why? Because the president's going there. So we might as well get there and do our part. So stay tuned to that. Perhaps you can visit that show as well, SG Anon. And in conclusion of this special broadcast, SG Anon is in very, very high demand for those that are in the broadcasting and podcasting world. In addition to that, SG, you have your own series of podcasts. Most of my audience knows who you are, appreciates your input, and follows you. But for those, and there's a lot of new people coming aboard, and we welcome you, and we're glad you're here. It's part of my catapulting numbers at JMC Broadcasting on new folks coming in. Tell everybody how they can reach you, how they can follow you in your direct work, in addition to you being a guest on other people's platforms.
Well, I appreciate that. I can be found on 4 platforms online. I'm on rumble.com at the handle Q News Patriot. I'm not on Rumble by the name SG Anon. So the URL is rumble.com/user/Q News Patriot. I can be found on Truth Social, X, and Telegram. I'm on Truth at the handle Real, REAL, SG Anon with a red check mark. I'm on X at the handle THE Q News Patriot with a blue check mark and a username of SG Anon. And I can be found on Telegram at the address t.me/real, REAL, Q News Patriot. John Michael, I appreciate you having me back on the show. It's always a pleasure having broadcasts like this and having discussions with you. It really is an incredible world that we're moving into. We just have to be patient and be willing to see the method to the madness, because there is indeed a method and a design to it.
You bet. And I'll close out with this also. Another way to connect up with SG Anon, you go to my site, jmcbroadcasting.com. You go to the upper left-hand portion of the navigation bar. Second tab says contributors. And you'll see a list of all the contributors that I interview, from Juan O'Savin to Ricardo Bosi. SG Anon is also featured there. You'll see the image that you see on this screen, and a biography of SG there, and a link to his world. Thank you very much, SG. You're an incredible patriot, very knowledgeable, and very high-level analysis, which I and